Okay, so now we're going to be talking about Plato and Aristotle. These two readings are difficult, so be prepared to get a little frustrated. Remember, both Plato and Aristotle were alive over 2,000 years ago. And the fact that we today are still reading them says something about the power of their words and the power of their ideas. Now, please note, these ideas are very abstract. We're going to be talking about truth, knowledge, happiness, ignorance. And Plato and Aristotle try to present these ideas in clear, simple ways. However, it's still not that simple. So be prepared to read these essays more than once, okay? So just when you're reading, stop and think, and you might have to reread numerous times. So just get ready for that, okay? So let's start with talking about what is an allegory. An allegory is a type of writing, a type of story. So an allegory is a symbolic narrative. It's a representation of an abstract or spiritual meaning through concrete or material forms. So remember, Plato's essay is trying to discuss the idea of truth, knowledge, and ignorance. And so how do you present these abstract ideas? How do you take this abstract concept and make it concrete? Well, he tells the story of men being chained in a cave. So you have men who are chained facing a wall. Behind them is the sunlight, the outside world, while the outside world casts shadows onto the cave wall. Remember, the men can only see the wall. So the men start to believe that what they see on the wall, the shadows, are true. And they start naming these things to help them understand. Well, one of the men who is chained breaks free and he exits the cave. When he exits the cave, he is overwhelmed, he is distorted, he is distraught, but slowly he starts to realize that the objects are not the same thing as the reflections. So he starts to gain knowledge. When he goes back to the cave to try to educate the men who are chained that objects and reflections are different, the men in the cave do not respond kindly. They respond violently. They do not want to learn anything new. They are satisfied with what they know to be true. So this story is a wonderful way to talk about truth, knowledge, and ignorance. So remember, the allegory is Plato's technique to discuss an abstract idea. So how do you talk about truth and ignorance and education? Well, you use a story to help talk about these concepts that are not tangible. So the setup of the men in the cave in the dark, that is helping us understand the bigger point. So one of Plato's major points, if you look on the PowerPoint, the world of sense perception is inferior to the world of ideal entities that exist only in the spiritual realm. I'm going to read point number 2. These ideals or forms are perceived directly by everyone before birth and then dimly remembered after birth. Okay, so Plato is saying that our senses are imperfect. They're not reliable, okay? And that humans are born, actually before birth, we are completely full of knowledge. We are utterly full of truth. And then after birth, we sort of start to forget. And our senses, we're trying to figure things out through our senses, and we're not always led down the right path with our senses, okay? But humans are born perfect, basically. Now, the memory, point number 3, the memory of these idols or forms allows people to understand the senses, even though the senses are unreliable and perceptions are not perfect. So the memory of the truth allows us to understand our senses. Our senses sort of encourage us to remember the truth. Now, this idea that human beings have this ability, we are capable of understanding and we have knowledge in our heads, is a very anti-materialistic point, right? We don't need things, we don't need objects, we don't need money, because it's all inside of us. And finally, we cannot rely solely on our senses and our perceptions. We must know what is beyond perception and ourselves. So we need to go outside the cave. That's an important point. Our senses, our interpretation of events is not the only way we will understand the truth of the world. And we have to be willing to push ourselves. A very important point by Plato. All right, so Plato, again, we're talking about abstract ideas. What is truth? What is knowledge? How do we get it? Well, Plato is making an interesting point about humanity, that we have the ability to find and understand truth. It is inside of us. But we have to work through our senses, which in a way are inhibiting our understanding of the truth. And we gotta kind of work through that to really be able and willing to find what is right. I'm going to summarize the allegory for you one more time, okay? So imagine prisoners living since childhood in an underground cave, chained so that they cannot move or see anywhere but straight ahead. Behind them is a fire that casts shadows on the cave wall in front of the prisoners. And as people carry various objects past the fire, you can even think of fire and sunlight. The prisoners, seeing nothing but shadows, assume the shadows are there. Everything that's there on the wall, all those shadows are reality. If a prisoner were to be released and turned toward the light, he would not immediately be able to see the objects whose shadows he formerly watched, nor would he believe that these objects are more real than the shadows, and he would cling to his old idea of reality. He would have some fear and doubt. If the prisoner were taken out of the cave, he would then be more blinded by the sun's light. At first, he would see the shadows and the reflections more easily, and then he would see the objects, and then the heavens, and at last the sun, which he would reason about and deduce to be a very sort of good, right? That the sun is helping us understand the visual world. Now, remembering his old life in the cave, the prisoner would feel pity on his companions, and he would rejoice in his own good fortune. And he would feel like he needs to help those prisoners, okay? And if he were taken back to the cave, he would try his hardest to help his companions see the truth and to lead them out of the cave. Now, you want to think about the cave as the world of sight, and the firelight is the sun, and the journey upward is the soul's ascent into the intellectual's world. The sun is the idea of good and the author of all things beautiful and right. And the power on men who would act rationally must fix. Those who reach this utter world dislike returning to the cave because they know that's not true. The eye, you want to think about the eye, can be blinded by either abrupt light or abrupt darkness. But sight cannot be put into blind man's eyes. Rather, the soul must turn from darkness to light to use its capacity for perception of the good. All right, so that's kind of a quick summary. So the quote that I personally really like, whereas our argument shows that the power and capacity of learning exists in the soul already. I love this quote because we're talking about the power and the capacity of learning, the ability to learn, sort of the immense power that learning has exists in all of us. It's there. It's waiting to be unlocked. Our desire to learn and the power that learning gives us is already there. And some of us may be locked and chained to a cave, but we can break free. We are able if we are willing. So I think that quote is very important to understand. So before I talk about specific points of the aim of man, the essay, let's talk a little bit about Aristotle. So Aristotle was one of Plato's students, and some would argue he was one of the most brilliant students of Plato's. But Aristotle and Plato did not agree on all points. For example, Plato believed that good exists in a spiritual realm, Remember, he says that before birth, we all have this spiritual part of us that knows all truth and knows all good. Aristotle does not agree. He does not agree that that happiness can be achieved in heaven or in a spiritual realm, that things happen on earth and we need to be aware of what happens on earth. He also encourages us to understand that humanity needs to understand the differences of others to really understand what it means to be human. We all have different backgrounds, we all have different temperaments, we all have different sizes, we are all different, and all those differences color our perceptions of the world. So we need to be aware of differences. They're important to understand. We don't just disregard differences. So let's go into the essay, okay? Point number 1 in the essay, The Aim of Man. All knowledge and purpose aim at the good. Now, Aristotle's definition of the good, what we're achieving in life, the good, is very colored by Greek thinking. Okay, so he's saying the highest good is that for working of the state, what he calls statecraft. Now, this idea is central to ancient Greece, ancient Greek thinking. The idea that we need to work for the government, that always working for that Athenian model of democracy, that's the highest good, all right? The third point, the aim of statescraft is happiness for all citizens. To live well and to do good deeds are the same as to be happy. Again, working as a group for the government of democracy, that is happiness. Point number 4, it is wrong to assume that happiness is the product of chance. And point number 4, happiness requires an entire lifetime for its fulfillment. This means that the ultimate level of one's happiness is based on one's sum of virtuous activity, not that one is never happy until death. So that's important. Happiness just doesn't happen randomly. You have to work for it. And you have to work for it your entire life. And all of the moments, all of your virtuous moments work together to create ultimate happiness. And hopefully you're working toward a greater good, a greater cause for the community in which you live. And that you aren't working just for happiness in what you could call heaven or some other spiritual realm. You are working on earth with others. Does that make sense? All right, so let's go to a specific point from Aristotle's text. Okay, so I'm going to read the first quote. In speaking of a man's character, we do not say that he is wise or intellectual, but that he is gentle or temperate. Yet we praise the wise man too for the disposition he has developed within himself, and praiseworthy dispositions we call virtues. So let's start a man's character. We're talking about character traits, and Aristotle is saying that a character trait is not intelligence. A character trait is something that is just there. It doesn't change. It's just a part of the person that is there regardless of anything, and it rarely changes. So the idea of being gentle and kind, that is a character trait. Intelligence is not. But we do praise wise people. We do praise smart people for the disposition he has developed within himself. So now we're saying that man has the ability to create aspects of his personality. He is able to become something. And praiseworthy dispositions we call virtues. So a man has a choice. Right? A man has a choice to become the kind of person he wants. And if he chooses to do something good for others, that's a virtue. I like this quote because it's really talking about man has the ability, has the capability of becoming something. That there's this idea that man is not predestined for anything. That it's about choices. Right? That's a key point. Now, the second quote. Happiness, as we have said, involves not only a completeness of virtue, but also a complete lifetime for its fulfillment. I like this quote because it's saying that you can't just do one thing and all of a sudden you're happy. It's about a complete lifetime. All of the actions, all of the choices that a man makes will lead to happiness. It's not just one act of goodness. It's the entirety of it all. So it's not one moment in your life. It's the sum total of all of the moments in life. So Aristotle and Plato, these have not been easy authors to read. The ideas are interesting. They're abstract, but they're interesting. What do you think truth, ignorance, and happiness mean? How can a man become happy? What is the ultimate happiness? What do you think man needs to do to gain happiness? What is the aim of man in 2017? What do you think?